Hello, and welcome to HHH, the podcast where we talk about those horrible humans in history. I am your host, Angela Pearson, and thank you so much for joining in today. If you're new, welcome. If you have been around for a while, also, welcome back. Glad to have you all here. And make sure you have liked and subscribed to this podcast so you get notifications anytime a new episode is posted. Sorry about missing last week. It got a little crazy. So, like I said, always make sure you have the notifications not liked, on so you get notified when I release new episodes, just in case. Also, make sure you're sharing this with people you think will enjoy this kind of content. I'm trying to grow this channel. I am just doing this for fun, but it would be a lot more fun if we could get tons and tons of followers. So if you guys can share this, that would be amazing. Also, if you have any suggestions of horrible humans you would like to hear about, I love getting suggestions. I've gotten a couple that I've added to my list, but if you have any, you can message me on Facebook, Instagram, or even just comment on these episodes. I do see those and I will respond to you. So make sure you send those to me. Also, one last thing before we jump into this episode that I am super excited about. We have an official website for this podcast. And in addition to the website, on the website, you can actually get merch. So if you like my logo and you want it on a t-shirt or a sweatshirt or hat or something, you can now get that. It's so exciting. So if you would like some HHH merch, you can go to my website. It's just horriblehumansinhistory.com. I will be adding it to my Instagram as well as to my Facebook, but I'm so excited to announce that we have an official website where you can also purchase merch or just listen to these episodes if you would like. So anyways, that's my super exciting announcement. Thanks to my amazing husband for setting that up for me, because I am not very literate with those kinds of things. So thank you, my amazing hubby. So anyways, today, let's get on with it. What if I told you that one of the most infamous murder cases in America, in American history, was orchestrated by a man who never physically stabbed a single person, but still managed to change the entire country forever? A man whose childhood was chaos, whose teenage years were spent behind bars, and whose warped need for control turned into a group of lost young people into an instrument of terror. Today, we are diving into one of the darkest and most unsettling figures of the 20th century. This is the story of Charles Manson, his childhood, his years in reform school and prison, how he built what became known as the Manson Family. So if you hear me refer to the family, that is who we're talking about, and how his influence led to some of the most shocking murders in American history. So let's start at the very, very beginning, because Charles Manson wasn't actually born a monster, but the foundations were laid pretty early. So let's dive into this. Charles Miles Manson was born on November 12th, 1934 in Cincinnati, Ohio. His mother, Kathleen Maddox, was just 16 years old when he was born. She was described by relatives as impulsive, reckless, and deeply unstable. Sounds like it runs in the family. You'll see why later. Charles actually never knew his biological father, and his birth certificate originally listed him as having no father at all. So he didn't actually ever really know who his father was. Now, his mother, Kathleen, struggled with alcoholism and petty crime, and Charles's earliest years were defined by neglect. She just basically ignored him. One often repeated story that can be heard, if it's entirely true or not, we're not completely sure. It could just be an embellished story. But the story claims that Kathleen once traded baby Charles for a pitcher of beer at a bar. Sounds like a super loving mother to me. Even if this story isn't fully true, it shows us that he had very little stability that existed in his early life. So when Charles was just 4 years old, his mom was actually sentenced to prison, and it was in 1939 for armed robbery. 4-year-old Charles was sent to live with relatives on his mother's side, primarily his aunt and uncle in McMecken, West Virginia. Sorry, West Virginia, if I said that wrong. But the records kind of vary on who actually took care of him, what extended family actually took care of him. But we know for sure that they were part of Kathleen's Appalachian family. So unlike his chaotic life with his mother, this household was conservative, very religious, structured, and very strict. So for the first time in his life, Charles had something resembling stability. He finally had rules, he had people that were caring about him, those kinds of things. Relatives later described the household as ordinarily and rule-oriented. Or ordinarily. That word says orderly. So it was orderly and rule-oriented. And there was no evidence of any kind of extreme abuse or anything. In fact, compared to what he had been experiencing and what he would later experience in life at his reform schools, this was actually a very stable period in his life. But it wasn't super duper affectionate. It was stable, but not necessarily super loving either. Manson later described feeling like kind of an outsider. He felt unwanted and kind of like a burden on the family, which I could see if they received a child that kind of had a troubling past and wasn't used to stability. Could be a kind of a handful. Not that that's an excuse for their behavior in any way, just saying that I could see that maybe that's how they would treat him. He was reminded over and over that his mother was in prison, and that stigma mattered very deeply in a small Appalachian town in the late 1930s. So that was a big deal. And he was the, quote, kid with the criminal mother. So he couldn't outrun that identity. That's what stuck in this area. He attended local elementary school while he was in West Virginia. He was smaller than the other boys, so he wasn't super big. He was poorly dressed, and he got teased and bullied pretty relentlessly. Manson later claimed that he was very shy and anxious during this time, and teachers reportedly described him as withdrawn and prone to attention-seeking behavior, which is interesting because I feel like a lot of withdrawn kids don't want attention. They want to kind of blend in and disappear. So it's interesting that he had those two opposite behaviors. Now, there are stories, though, some come from Manson himself, who wasn't super reliable. Shocker. That his aunts once dressed him in girls' clothing as a joke before school. We don't know if this is actually true. Like I said, this actually came from himself. But he said that he felt pretty humiliated and powerless during this period of his life. And powerlessness is something that he would spend the rest of his life trying to eliminate, as you'll see in his behavior. So this pointed to a very key psychological shift for him. So for several years, his mother had been irresponsible, but present. And then suddenly she was gone. And then from age 4 to around age 9, he experienced the feelings of abandonment and his stigma and emotional distance. He had a little bit of structure in there. But then when his mother was released from prison in 1942, Manson reportedly cried when he saw her, but their relationship was never stable. Shocker. She quickly returned to her unstable behaviors like drinking and criminal activity. So just as he had just been adjusting, wow, that was a weird sentence. So just as he adjusted to the structure of life in West Virginia, he was ripped out of that structured life back into chaos. And this pattern of instability, stability, instability becomes a repeated theme throughout his life. So it's really important to be super careful right now in this point in the story, because there are a lot of children that experience poverty and parental incarceration and emotional neglect that don't ever become violent criminals. So we can't just assume that that is what led to his future issues. We have seen quite a big pattern of that on this podcast, but that doesn't mean that that's what they're doomed to become, because there is personal agency and everyone deals with issues differently. So, but for him specifically, he showed a lot of early behavioral issues. He had developed distrust of authority figures. I mean, that makes sense with his mother. He did not trust her. She was supposed to be the authority, but he could not trust her. He learned early that attachment was temporary, and he internalized shame and rejection. So those are really important when you think about his behavior later in life. It's going to be very apparent that those are the things he's trying to overcome. So when he actually built the Manson family later, he recreated something pretty eerily similar to a tight, isolated group with structured rules and with him as the actual authority. So, like I said, in his future behavior, you see him trying to overcome these internalized issues. So, so at this time, he was a very unwanted child, but in the future, he became wanted and he had all the control. So you're going to see how that flips. Anyways, continuing on. From an early age, he actually exhibited behavioral issues like stealing and lying and acting out for attention. School didn't offer any refuge for him because, like I mentioned, he got bullied for wearing raggedy clothes. And like I said, teachers described him as being very disruptive and emotionally detached. So by age 9, Charles Manson was already in trouble with the law. His first stay in a reform school set the tone for what would become a near constant cycle of incarceration in his life. These institutions were super brutal places at this time, especially throughout the 1940s and 1950s. Manson was beaten by other boys while he was in this reform school and reportedly sexually assaulted as well. So he learned really quickly that being vulnerable is very dangerous. So survival meant manipulation, intimidation, and emotional detachment. So that is what he did. So instead of rehabilitation, these reform schools actually really hardened him. He became adept at reading people, figuring out who he could control, who he could charm, and who posed an actual threat to him. This skill would later become one of his most dangerous weapons, because if you can learn how to manipulate people, you can kind of control them, which you'll see he was really good at later. Now, he ran away repeatedly when he got out of these reform schools. He committed burglaries. He stole cars. He was sent back again and again. And by his late teens, prison felt more familiar to him than the outside world, because that's where he spent more of his time. Now, in his early 20s, Manson drifted across the county committing fraud, theft, and forgery. He married briefly and fathered at least one child, but his domestic life never lasted. He actually was legally married twice, though there was also a later attempt at a third marriage, but that never went through, and I'll bring that up a little later. His first wife was Rosalie Jean Willis. She was a teenage hospital waitress from West Virginia. She was only 17 years old when she married Manson in January of 1955, and Manson was 20 years old. They moved to California shortly after marrying, and Rosalie became pregnant pretty quickly. Manson soon began stealing cars and committing fraud again. I wonder if she knew about it. I'm guessing she did not. And in 1956, he was actually arrested for transporting a stolen vehicle across state lines, and he was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. Now, Rosalie initially visited him while he was in prison and even brought their baby son to come see him. And they named him Charles Manson Jr., but eventually she stopped coming. Probably a good move on her part, just saying. Now, by 1957, 1958, she had actually started another relationship with another man and filed for divorce from Charles, so she could actually move on with her life. And their marriage officially ended in 1958. Well, Manson was released early for parole in 1958 and soon met his second wife. He didn't wait long to move on. His second wife was Leona Ray Stevens, nicknamed Candy because she was a sex worker in Los Angeles. Now, they married in 1959, and it wasn't long before Manson was again involved in check fraud and pimping related charges. So in 1960, so just a year later, he was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, and Stevens gave birth to his second son, Charles Luther Manson. So he's got two sons named Charles Manson. Poor kids. In 1963 is when this boy was born. And not shockingly, she filed for divorce while he was still incarcerated. And just like his first marriage, this one ended during one of his prison terms. So clearly, stability really bored him, and he became very obsessed with control. And these ladies did not like that, which good for them. They definitely made the right choice in walking away from this one. Now, going back to 1961 really quick, when he was sentenced to federal prison for a series of crimes involving stolen checks and credit card fraud, ironically, this prison sentence would prove pivotal to him. Now, while he was incarcerated for this series of crimes, Manson immersed himself in self-help books, Scientology materials, Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, and writings of fringe religious and philosophical thinkers. He also really learned to manipulate people, but one of the most important things he learned how to play the guitar, and he studied popular music trends. Now you're probably asking, why would that be the most important thing? We'll get there. Just hold your horses. We're getting there. So in prison, he blended folk music, religious mysticism, apocalyptic imagery, and narcissistic mythology. Making himself a myth, basically. I can't say it. Mythologizing. There we go. We got it. He later claimed that prison was his, quote, education, and his music became both a creative outlet and a tool. That's important. His music became a tool. He wasn't very technically skilled, but he was very charismatic and intense. So when he was released in 1967, he didn't just want freedom. He wanted fame. He thought he was that good. He thought he was the shiz and was going to dominate the music world. So he actually, while he was in prison, learned how to mirror emotions, how to exploit insecurities, and how to position himself as both the victim and the savior. Prison psychologists later noted that Manson showed signs of extreme narcissism, shocker, and antisocial personality traits. I mean, we have looked at so many of these cult leaders and dictators and narcissism, and I would agree with the antisocial stuff. All of that very predominant in almost every single person that we talk about. Now, when he was released in March of 1967, Manson asked prison officials not to let him out. He didn't want to leave, actually, because prison was the only world he knew, and society was changing, and he was about to find a very fertile ground for what he had to offer to the world. Now, Manson emerged in the heart of the Summer of Love. In San Francisco in 1967, it was filled with disillusioned, not delusioned, well, kind of delusioned, but also disillusioned young people searching for meaning. They wanted community, and they really wanted to rebel against authority. So Manson offered all of that, wrapped up in a pseudo-spiritual jargon and a very warped philosophy. He preached that society was corrupt, that love was freedom, and that he had special insight into the true nature of reality. This worked in his favor because, remember, he thought he was going to be a big musician. Folk music was very popular at the time. Psychedelia was exploding. Apocalyptic and mystical lyrics were very trendy, and young people were searching for spiritual leaders. And unfortunately, some people found him as their spiritual leader, which we'll talk about in a second. So he began performing his songs for followers in small communal settings, so it was very personal and close. And he was usually high on LSD, which really intensified the experience and blurred everyone's perceptions of what was happening. Now, themes in his lyrics included death, ego disillusion, apocalypse, personal transformation, and hidden knowledge. And to his followers, his music felt so profound and just so enlightened and whoa, dude. This is so good. But to a trained musician, it was repetitive and amateurish. They did not like it. But music wasn't just art for Manson. Remember, I said this was the most important thing he learned in prison because it became his recruitment tool. How did he use music as a tool, you may ask? Well, he made sure that he did very intimate acoustic performances and always made very intense eye contact. The lyrics were repetition, and he used group reinforcement, basically peer pressure, to convince people to follow him. So music became part of his psychological control system. That is why that was so important for him to learn in prison. Now, this is where things get kind of wild, because I'm guessing a lot of people don't actually know this. But in 1968, Manson met Dennis Wilson. If you don't know who Dennis Wilson is, he is the drummer of the Beach Boys. Now, if you don't know who the Beach Boys are, oh, I can't help you. You're just going to have to go look them up on your own because they're amazing. And if you don't know who they are, you need to educate yourself. I tell you what, they are amazing. Anyways, back to our story. Dennis Wilson, drummer of the Beach Boys, very, very popular music group. He met Manson when Wilson picked up 2 female followers of Manson while they were hitchhiking. So he picked up these ladies and they're like, dude, you got to meet this guy. He's so enlightened. He's so great. You have to meet him. So they met up, and eventually Wilson, the Beach Boys drummer, became fascinated by Manson. The Manson family, so this is the cult that Charles Manson is setting up. The Manson family actually moved into Wilson's mansion temporarily, so they lived with the Beach Boys drummer temporarily. Manson played music for Wilson and all of his celebrity circle of friends. Because all of this attention he was getting, Manson really believed he was about to make it. He thought, I am on my way. I am about to become famous. I got this. And Wilson even introduced Manson to producer Terry Melker. Melker listened to Manson's recordings and told him, basically, I'll let you know if we'll produce your music for you. But he never reached out. Basically ghosted him. Ghosting wasn't a thing at the time, but that's basically what he did. He basically just ghosted Manson and never reached out, and ultimately passed on him, thinking his music was too amateur. He did not like it very much. Now, this rejection hit Manson super hard. He took it very personal. It wasn't just a career disappointment like most people would see it. It was a narcissistic injury. Like, it hit him in his core because he believed he was the best. Now, in ways, I don't blame Manson for kind of feeling this way, because he wrote a song, not because I think he was good or anything, but let me explain. He wrote a song called Cease to Exist. Now, the Beach Boys recorded a modified version titled Never Learn Not to Love. But they did change Manson's lyrics, but he was not properly credited, and he received no real industry launch from it. Like, he got no benefit from it. And Manson felt so betrayed because of this. And I don't blame him. Like, if that happened to anyone else, I think anyone else would be very upset. But I don't think they would turn into a murderous cult leader. So there's the difference. There's where the line is drawn, I guess. I felt bad until he went cuckoo crazy. So here are some important information that you need to know for the future events in this story. So the house where actress Sharon Tate lived had previously been rented by Terry Melker. Now, Sharon Tate, spoiler, is one of the victims of the Manson family. And she actually was renting the house that Terry Melker, the producer that rejected Manson, lived in. Now, while the murders weren't purely about Melker and the rejection, the connection kind of deepens the psychological resentment that Manson carried towards Hollywood rejection. So it makes me wonder if he actually knew that's who was living there or who wasn't, but he knew that Terry had lived there. Now, Manson's music for him was validation. It was a pathway to fame and a tool for manipulation and proof in his own mind that he was special. And when that dream collapsed, his rhetoric grew very dark very quickly. Some criminologists argue that his failure in Hollywood intensified his Helter Skelter delusion. Now, what is Helter Skelter, you might ask? Well, we will be talking about Helter Skelter in a second. I keep telling you that in a second we're going to talk about these things in a second. But we're getting there. Whether that's fully accurate or not, the rejection clearly fueled his resentment towards the famous and the wealthy. Now, for his followers, he specifically targeted young women first. Often the young women that were estranged from their families or struggling with their own identity, and through flattery, drugs, especially LSD, sleep deprivation, and constant psychological pressure, he slowly broke them down and kind of removed all their sense of self so he could replace it with his own version of what he thought they should be. Now, soon these followers would surrender all of their money, their autonomy, and even their names. They all became the Manson family. That was the name of their group. Eventually, the group relocated to Spawn Ranch. It was a dilapidated former movie set outside of Los Angeles, so not a super great place to live. There, Manson's control intensified because they all became isolated. He positioned himself as a Masonic, as like the savior, sometimes claiming to be Jesus, sometimes the devil, sometimes both at the same time. So he was their savior, but also the devil, but also who knows. So this is where we are going to talk about Helter Skelter. So now Charles Manson's belief in, quote, Helter Skelter was his central belief. It was a delusional, apocalyptic ideology that he preached to the Manson family during the late 1960s. Basically, Manson prophesied that an imminent catastrophic race war between Black Americans and white Americans was coming. He named this war Helter Skelter. So if you ever hear Helter Skelter outside of the next context I'm going to share, this is what he's talking about, a race war between Black Americans and white Americans. Now, he named this war Helter Skelter after the Beatles song from their 1968 album, The White Album. He claimed that the Beatles were sending him coded messages through their music, predicting this war and positioning himself as a key figure in the aftermath. Obviously. Why wouldn't the Beatles be sending him personal messages through their music that were about a war that was coming? How people believed this? I don't know. Anyways, according to testimony from some of the former family members, such as Paul Watkins and Linda Casabane, sorry, Linda, if I said your name wrong. These were the main things about Helter Skelter. So first, Black Americans, and he called them quote unquote Blackie. That's what he called them, not me. They would rise up against whites due to built up race tensions, oppression, and frustrations from the civil rights era. Blacks would ultimately win the war because they were stronger in numbers and fighting spirit, slaughtering most of the whites. However, Black people supposedly lacked the intelligence or leadership skills to govern the post-war world. Man, this dude was super racist. Manson and his family, quote-unquote family, would survive by hiding in a secret underground refuge, basically a bottomless pit in Death Valley, inspired by a biblical reference in Revelations 9. So they would go into this bottomless pit during the chaos. And then after the war ended, the family would emerge as rulers, with Manson as the ultimate leader or messiah. Blacks would turn to them for guidance, and the family would dominate because of their superior intellect and preparation. Yeah. All I have to say is, who in their right mind would believe this weird racist plan? What in the actual world is happening? Like, who was like, you know what? this makes sense. Anyways. Again, all these cults, every time we talk about their philosophies and their beliefs, I'm like, blown away at the things that people will believe. But that is what him and his family believed. Now, Charles Manson blended this with elements from the Bible, especially the book of Revelations. That was his favorite. He used Scientology concepts, and he used fringe culture, like counterculture ideas, and his own paranoia and delusions that he was the savior. He often spoke of it daily using phrases like, Helter Skelter is coming down, to hype up his followers. Now, Manson became... I want to go back to the Beatles really quick. Manson became obsessed with the White Album after its release in 1968. He played it repeatedly while dosing followers with LSD, claiming the songs contained hidden prophecies directed specifically to him. Now, the specific songs he believed they were communicating with were Helter Skelter. Manson saw it as a metaphor for the chaotic spiraling descent into race war. And then the next one was Piggies. He linked pigs, quote unquote pigs, to wealthy white establishment figures, hence blood writings like death to pigs at crime scenes, which is what they did at the crime scenes. Revolution 9 was one that he believed was talking to him. Its chaotic sound, collage, and repeated number 9 phrase were interpreted as apocalyptic signals. And other tracks like Blackbird or Rocky Raccoon were twisted into fit racial themes. So Manson believed that the Beatles, whom he saw as 4 angels from Revelations, by the way, were communicating with him personally, and even tried to contact them via letters or telegrams to collaborate musically. In reality, the Beatles had no such intent. Paul McCartney later called Manson's interpretation horrific, and George Harrison found the association upsetting and sleazy. Now, Manson started to grow impatient when the prophesied war didn't start naturally, obviously, because that's what cult leaders do when their prophecies don't come true. So he decided to take things into his own hands, again, like what all cult leaders tend to do. He decided that by committing a high-profile murder or murders of wealthy white people, like Sharon Tate, and the LaBiancas, I am hoping I'm saying their names right, and staging them to look like black militant attacks, writing phrases like Rise, Death to Pigs, and Helter Skelter in victims' blood would incite white backlash and spark full-scale racial conflicts, thus fulfilling his vision. So he decided that is what needed to happen to make this war get initiated. So family members testified that Manson used Helter Skelter rhetoric to motivate them, framing the killings as necessary to, quote, bring it down and prepare for their rise. In August of 1969, he ordered members of the family to commit a series of murders in Los Angeles. Over 2 nights, 7 people were brutally killed, including actress Sharon Tate, who was 8 months pregnant. The murders were grotesque, theatrical, and intentionally shocking, designed to terrorize the public and frame black activists for the crimes. There were at least 9 confirmed killings, though, and some sources suggest that the total could be higher, up to 24 or even 35, based off of later claims and unsolved cases. So there's a wide range of how many people are actually believed to have been killed because of Charles Manson's family. It is important to note that Manson himself did not actually physically commit the murders, but was convicted as the mastermind behind all of the murders. He had been the one directing all of his followers, whom he'd quote-unquote programmed through drugs, isolation, and indoctrination. The actual killers included Susan Atkins, Charles, quote, Text, Watson, Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten, Linda Casbian, who acted as a lookout and later testified for the prosecution, and others like Bobby Biosalulu, I can't say his name, and Steve Clem Gorgon. The victims were chosen for their perceived wealth or connections to Manson's grudges, such as against music producer Terry Melker, like I said. Sharon Tate was living in his previous home, and we're going to go through these murders super quick. So here's the timeline of these murders. So the murders span from July to September of 1969, primarily around Los Angeles. So let's go through these real quick. So on July 25th through the 27th, 1969, Gary Hinman, age 34, who was a musician and an acquaintance of the family, was held captive for days. He was tortured and robbed under the belief that he had inheritance money. He was stabbed multiple times in the chest after refusing to sign over his vehicles and property. The killers wrote "Political Piggy" and his blood on the walls. Now, this murder was initially unrelated to the Helter Skelter movement, but it really helped solidify the family's violent loyalty to Charles Manson. Now, August 8th through the 9th, because it happened late in the night on the 8th and early in the morning on the 9th. So basically same time period. Anyways, so this was Sharon Tate. She was 26 years old. She was an actress. And like I said, she was 8.5 months pregnant. So she was almost due. Jay Sebring, age 35. He was a celebrity hairstylist. Abigail Folger. She was 25, and she was a coffee heiress of Folger, the coffee. Okay, this name is hard. Wojciech, Wojciech Brykowski. He was age 32. He was a writer and actor. Stephen Parent, age 18, and he was just visiting. He was just in his car, just visiting. Now, Manson sent the group to the former home of Terry Melker with orders to totally destroy everyone in the house, as gruesome as you can. Now, Stephen Parent was shot 4 times in his car in the driveway. Like I said, he was literally just gotten there just to visit. And inside, the others were bound, stabbed, and shot. Tate was stabbed 16 times while begging for her unborn child's life. Sebring was stabbed 7 times and shot once. Folger was stabbed 28 times after fleeing because her body was found in the yard. Brykowski was stabbed 51 times and shot twice and bludgeoned 13 times on the head. And then Pig was written in Tate's blood on the front door. Roman Polanski was away in Europe at the time, so that was the other person that should have been there. And I believe that was Sharon Tate's husband at the time. So they were pretty vicious with these murders. Like stabbing someone 51 times and then beating them and shooting them. That's a little excessive. For what? Because someone told you to do it. Now on August 9th and 10th, again, this happened over a night. Lino LaBianca, age 44, he was a grocery store executive, and his wife, Rosemary LaBianca, age 38. Manson was very dissatisfied with the previous night's sloppiness, so the Sharon Tate murder. So he actually sent the family out again, and he personally selected the LaBianca home at random. He tied the couple up, robbing them, and then he came outside and said, all right, now go and finish the job and do it correctly this time. And then he left. So the remaining killers stabbed Lino 12 times, including with a carving fork that they left in his stomach. I actually watched a documentary where they showed it, the carving knife that they used. And then Rosemary, they stabbed 41 times. Messages like rise, death to pigs, and Helter Skelter, a misspelling of Helter Skelter, so they spelled it Healter instead of Helter. They were all written in blood on the walls and refrigerator, and a war was carved into Lino's abdomen. So, yeah, they were not super nice with these people. And then late August, early September 1969, Donald Shorty Shea, Shorty is his nickname, he was 35. He was a Hollywood stuntman and a ranch hand at the ranch that the family was living at. Shea was targeted because Manson suspected him of being a police informant and for helping evict the family from the ranch. He was lured to a remote area, beaten, stabbed multiple times, and decapitated, though his body wasn't found until 1977. The murder was covered up for much longer than all of the others. Now, while those are the core murders tied to the family, in 1969, some sources indicate potential involvement in more deaths. For instance, Manson claimed that, while he was in prison, in tapes that were released in 2024, that he had committed a lot of killings in Mexico, including leaving people's bodies on the beaches, but there's no way to actually verify that this is true. And he was very manipulative and a liar, so they don't know if they can fully trust his word on that. So, the Manson family members responsible for the murders were able to evade detection for months because the crime appeared super random. There was a lack of obvious connections to the perpetrators, and police initially pursued other leads, aka drug-related motives or other suspects. They cleared Sharon Tate's husband as a suspect, all of that kind of stuff. The breakthrough came when a combination of unrelated arrests happened, loose lips with the group, and confessions from insiders. That's how they finally caught them. After the August murders, Charles Manson grew increasingly paranoid about potential informants and law enforcement attention at the ranch. That's why he ended up killing that one ranch hand. And it's shocking that a cult leader would be paranoid. It's not like we've ever heard that before. Who would have guessed, right? Now, he relocated most of the family to a remote Baker Ranch in Death Valley, California, where they engaged in activities like vehicle theft, vandalism, and that was probably the best strategy to not draw attention to themselves. And I'm being slightly sarcastic because on October 12th, 1969, Manson and several followers were arrested during a raid at Barker Ranch on suspicion of grand theft auto and related charges. This was not in connection to the murders at all. Manson was jailed in Independence, California on these lesser offenses, so no one suspected them of committing these murders at this moment. Now, this arrest kept some of the family members in custody or under scrutiny, setting the stage for later revelations. So they started increasing the pressure, not knowing what was going to be revealed. The real turning point occurred when Susan Atkins, one of the primary Tate murderers who stabbed Sharon Tate and others, was already in jail for the murder of Gary Hinman, so unrelated. While she was held at the women's detention facility in Los Angeles, Atkins began to brag about her involvement in the Tate murders to two of her fellow inmates. She provided graphic details, including stabbing Sharon Tate, who was begging for her baby's life, tasting her blood, and writing pig and blood on the door. Atkins reportedly said the crimes were meant to shock the world and tied them to the group's ideology. Her fellow inmates initially doubted the story due to its sensational nature, but later reported it to the authorities after realizing it matched the unsolved case details. This information reached LAPD detectives in early November 1969. Around the same time, so unrelated, around the same time, November 12th, 1969, at the ranch, a visitor named Al Springer told police that Manson had bragged about, quote, knocking off 5 pigs shortly after the Tate murders. So now the police were super suspicious. So LAPD detectives, now linked to the confession to the Tate case, interviewed more family members and cross-referenced other evidence. And Linda Casbian, who had been the outlook during the Tate murders, participated very minimally in the LaBianca murders, fled the group, and cooperated with authorities, providing crucial testimony in exchange for her immunity. She confirmed details and identities of the participants. Now, Charles, quote, Tex Watson was apprehended in Texas on November 30th, 1969, after he fled to escape prosecution. By early December, investigators had enough evidence to tie Manson, still in custody, from the auto theft charges, and some of his followers for the murders. On December 8th, 1969, in Los Angeles County grand jury indicted Manson, Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Linda Casbian, and Tex Watson for the Tate murders and conspiracy to murder in Manson's case. They were also indicted along with Leslie Van Houten for the LaBianca murders shortly after. Now, their trial began in June of 1970. The Manson family was eventually undone by its own chaos. Arrests for unrelated crimes in combination with informants and witness testimonies led investigators to them. Now, it's kind of creepy if you watch footage from when they're in jail. Like, Manson still had control over his followers while they were in prison. Like, he carved a swastika in his face. And so they all carved swastikas in their face and like shaved their heads and did all kinds of weird things while these trials are going on. So despite his attempts to manipulate the proceedings in these court cases, Manson was convicted in 1971 and sentenced to death. But later, that sentence was commuted to life in prison when California abolished the death penalty. So Manson spent the rest of his life behind bars, but he still continued to attract attention through interviews, bizarre letters, and a lingering fascination with his crimes. And remember how I said that he almost got married a third time? Well, here it is. In 2014, while he was in prison in his late 70s, he obtained a marriage license with Afton Elaine Burton, a 26-year-old woman who called herself quote-unquote star. And I'm sure you're wondering, what happened to stop this marriage? Well, she had been visiting him in prison for years and believed in his ideology. How? How? That's my question. How do you believe that garbage? Anyways, she must not have been super bright. Because unfortunately for them, their marriage license expired and the wedding never legally happened. There are rumors she may have had ulterior motives relating to the publicity of being attached to him. So that wouldn't be surprising. So over time, though, Manson's health really deteriorated. He was denied parole multiple times, deemed a continuing danger to society, which makes sense. And eventually he died on November 19th, 2017 at the age of 83 from complications related to colon cancer. So he died as he lived, confined, infamous, and still misunderstood by those who tried to mythologize him. Well, got that word. So Charles Manson didn't pull the knife, he didn't stab anyone, but he brainwashed the hands that did. His story is a really chilling reminder of how charisma, neglect, and manipulation can combine into something truly destructive, and how people can be manipulated to do basically anything. So keep your wits about you, my friends. Don't be manipulated by crazy people like this. His story just reminds us that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like lost men offering answers to lost people and playing pretty music. Which, it's still not super pretty music, but, here we go. Anyways, thank you so much for listening today. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure you like, subscribe. Make sure you send me any horrible humans that you would like to hear about. I would love to hear about that. Make sure you check out my website. Again, that's horriblehumansinhistory.com. See if there's any merch on there that you would like. And join me next week as we are going to head to the early 1800s in France. We are going to be talking about a woman who is believed to have killed over 30 people. Her name is Helena Jagodo. So be sure to tune in as we talk about her eerie story. So we will see you guys next week. Bye.